It was just another ceremony on base. One of those formal mornings when the brass polished their medals and cadets stood straighter than ever. The sun was just beginning to heat the concrete, and the flags barely moved in the soft wind. Rows of uniforms lined the chairs, stiff-backed and proud. Families sat in the rear, murmuring gently, waiting for the general to arrive. It was a day to honor service, but no one expected it to become something they'd never forget. She wasn't supposed to stand out. She never did. She walked quietly with a slow, steady step, her hands tucked into the pockets of a faded olive-green jacket. It was old, almost too old. Stitching along the collar had started to fray, and the sleeves didn't quite reach her wrists anymore. The boots she wore were scuffed, laces faded to gray. Everything about her looked worn, not dirty, just aged, like something that had lived through too much but still chose to keep walking. Some of the younger cadets noticed her first. They were clustered off to the side, half watching, half whispering, as she took a seat near the middle of the gathering. One elbowed the other and chuckled quietly. "Look at that jacket," he whispered, straight out a nom. "Maybe she got lost," the other said, smirking. "He probably thinks it's a VA clinic." They weren't trying to be cruel, but they were young, yet too young to understand what history sometimes looks like. They saw a woman in her late 60s, maybe older, thin hair pinned back neatly. No name badge, no ribbons, just that tired old jacket with a strange patch over the heart. The patch was barely visible from where they stood, faded into the fabric, the edges soft from years of wear. They didn't recognize it, but someone did. A few minutes later, the general arrived. Not just any general, Marcus Ellington. Known for his silence, his precision, his refusal to entertain politics or flattery, he didn't smile often, and when he did, it meant something. As he stepped up to the podium, he gave the usual scan of the crowd, measuring, observing. His eyes passed over dozens of uniforms. Then they stopped. They stopped on her. There was a flicker in his expression, barely a second of pause. He stepped down from the podium, walked slowly across the aisle, right past his aides. Everyone turned to watch. Conversations hushed. No one spoke. The general approached the woman in the old jacket. She stood slowly, unsure of what to do. He looked at her chest, at the faded patch, half covered by the fabric's fold. His posture shifted. He took off his cap. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. Simply removed his cap and lowered his head. The air changed. No one understood what was happening. The cadets from earlier stared, mouths slightly open, hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. Even the colonels watched silently, confused. But the woman, her eyes didn't widen. She didn't react with pride. She simply looked back at the general and gave a tiny nod. That was all. A moment between two people who knew what that patch meant. After a few seconds, the general stepped back. He turned toward the crowd and said only one sentence. "She wore that patch when no one else would." Then he put his cap back on, returned to the podium, and began the ceremony like nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Word spread fast after the event. Someone had snapped a picture of the moment. It made its way onto a military forum. A few older vets began posting stories. Stories about a medic unit that operated deep behind enemy lines during a conflict that never made headlines. A unit made up of volunteers, mostly women who were trained to handle battlefield wounds without support. They operated alone, carried no weapons. And this woman, in that faded jacket, was one of the only surviving members. The patch she wore? It was the insignia of Shadow Company Medevac 9, a name that wasn't in textbooks. You had to serve too. Know it. You had to bleed to respect it. Turns out she had pulled injured soldiers out of wrecked helicopters with bullets flying over her head, carried wounded men through mud while explosions shook the ground. She never got medals. She never asked. She just came home and faded back into the crowd. She never updated the jacket. Had stains that couldn't come out. Threads that told. Stories without words. That patch wasn't a display, was a scar made of fabric. A few days after the event, the cadets who had laughed found her name. They requested to meet her. She agreed. They apologized. She didn't scold them. Instead, she smiled gently and said, "You weren't wrong. It's an old jacket. But I wore it when I needed it most." One of them asked what the patch meant. She looked at him for a long time, then said, "It means I stayed when others ran. It means I held a man's hand while he died, so he wouldn't feel alone." They didn't know what to say. Before they left, one cadet asked her why she never replaced it. She looked down at the jacket, rubbed her thumb along the edge of the patch, said, "Because this jacket remembers, even when the world forgets." Word of the general's gesture spread across bases. Quietly, respectfully, there were no news stories, no press coverage, just whispers, nods. A new kind of reverence for someone who wore her service on her sleeves, not her chest. And at the next ceremony, she was invited again. This time no one laughed. In fact, when she arrived, the cadets stood. Every one of them, not because of her rank, not because of a speech, but because they had finally learned what real honor looked like. As the months rolled on, her presence became something of a legend on base. She never sought attention, never stood at the front of the room unless called, but her chair was always filled, always near the corner, quiet, observant, and still people noticed the way she scanned the room before she spoke, the way her hands rested calmly on the table, as if she'd already weathered 100 storms before breakfast. To some, she was just the woman with the patch. But to those who'd seen her eyes when she looked at maps, heard her voice when she spoke about lives on the line, she was something else. She was living history, scarred, breathing page of a chapter most had never read. One night, the base was hit with a sudden emergency drill. Sirens blared, boots scrambled, and the room filled with stress and confusion. Orders were misheard, radios fumbled, and young lieutenants looked to each other for guidance. Then someone shouted, "Where is she?" It was the first time anyone had called for her first. She arrived calm as a lake and took command without needing to raise her voice. Her instructions were firm, clear, and fast. Within minutes, the confusion fell into rhythm, like soldiers falling in step. And when it was over, everyone realized what had just happened. She didn't need a rank to lead. She just needed a moment to be heard. In the days that followed, officers began studying her pass, not out of curiosity, but reverence. They learned she had once dragged a wounded pilot through gunfire, that she'd flown medevac missions into war zones where even fighter jets wouldn't risk going, that she'd been the last one out of a collapsing base overseas, refusing to leave until the final injured soldier had been lifted into safety. And that insignia on her jacket? It belonged to a unit so secret, so elite, that most had only read about it in clearance-restricted files. She had never mentioned it, never needed to. One evening, the base hosted a formal ceremony. Rows of soldiers stood in perfect formation, medals glinting under the stage lights. But when her name was called and the room rose to applaud, she didn't step onto the stage. She remained where she was, off to the side, arms folded, lips drawn in a tight, almost nostalgic smile. Only when the general himself walked down from the podium and saluted her directly did she finally nod. No speech, no words. Just mutual respect, exchanged in silence. Back at her modest quarters, the walls were bare. No awards hung, no photos framed. Only a small, creased letter pinned near her desk. It was handwritten, old, nearly faded, from a fellow soldier who didn't make it home. The message was short. If you're reading this, it means you made it. Keep walking. Keep teaching. Don't let them forget us. That letter was the only reminder she needed of why she carried herself the way she did, not for attention, not for glory, but for memory. New recruits began to speak about her like a figure out of legend. They'd whisper stories, trade details, ask each other questions like, is it true she fixed a downed chopper with her bare hands? Did she really walk 8 miles under fire to rescue her squad? And while not all the stories were true, the reverence was in a world obsessed with speed and noise. She became their example of quiet power. Steady, unshaken, real. Years later, she quietly retired. No big send-off was held by her choice. She left the base the same way she arrived, unnoticed by most, remembered by few. But those who had sat in the same rooms, followed her lead, or watched her steady hand guide chaos into order. They never forgot. In every decision they made going forward, her presence lingered, like a compass needle, always pointing toward integrity. And in the academy hall, right outside the training room where new officers were taught battlefield ethics, a plaque was quietly mounted. It didn't carry her full name. Just a single line. Beneath a small brass insignia, she walked quietly so others could lead boldly. No title, no rank, just legacy. And in that legacy, her silence spoke louder than 1,000 commands ever could.